All right, so on Monday, the Supreme Court is going to be hearing a couple of cases that, if they end up deciding them the way that we think that they are, based on their current statements and some of the questions that they've had during these hearings, is basically going to do absolutely nothing other than further perpetuate the rampant corruption that goes on within every single level of our political system. So I got a breakdown here from the New York Times. Essentially, this is involving a couple of Andrew Cuomo aides and some pretty brazen and open corruption that they were both engaging in, and it now seems like the Supreme Court is going to be overturning their convictions. So here from the New York Times, they say Supreme Court seems poised to limit public corruption cases. So what are they talking about here? They say the Supreme Court, which has become increasingly skeptical of federal prosecutions of public corruption in state government, seems poised on Monday to hand prosecutors two more defeats. They say the justices heard arguments in a pair of cases involving defendants convicted of fraud during former Governor Andrew M. Cuomo's administration in New York. Now, obviously, Andrew Cuomo himself had a lot of corruption allegations surrounding his handling of COVID towards the beginning of the pandemic, and some of the money he was getting from a lot of these nursing home corporations. So he, in and of himself, was a massively corrupt politician. Obviously, he ended up resigning from the position, and that was over sexual harassment allegations. Didn't have anything to do with his mishandling of the COVID pandemic. But that guy obviously has been rampantly corrupt throughout his entire career, and these are basically just some of his lackeys who were convicted for corruption under him. So they say one of these cases concerned Joseph Percoco, a former aide to Mr. Cuomo, convicted of taking illicit payments to benefit a Syracuse area developer. They say the other involved Louis Simonelli, the owner of a Buffalo construction firm, convicted of fraud in a bid rigging scandal in connection with Buffalo Billion. That just sounds like an evil enterprise there, a development project championed by Mr. Cuomo. They say the question in the first case, Percoco versus United States number whatever, was whether Mr. Percoco could be prosecuted under federal law that makes it a crime to deprive the government of, quote, honest services for conduct that took place after he resigned his government position to run the governor's 2014 re-election campaign. And they got a quote here from, or a couple statements here from the lawyer for Mr. Percoco, and he said that the law only applies to people who exercise the authority of the government, a power that he said his client had lacked when he received the payments. Okay, so basically, just to summarize where we're at so far, they're talking about a case where this guy was essentially taking payments from some private entity and then going back into a position of government and lobbying essentially Governor Cuomo, who he was working for, on their behalf. Now, the argument that the lawyer is laying out here with this quote that we're about to get into is essentially, well, technically, he wasn't in that position within government at the time that this was taking place. So therefore, even though after he went back into government and started acting on behalf of those corrupting interests and, influencing the Cuomo administration on their behalf, then that can't count as corruption because there was a little period of time there where he technically was not in the government, although he was still involved in politics, okay, and clearly had political influence. So it's a ridiculous defense, but it's one that it seems like the Supreme Court is probably going to side with. So the quote here from his lawyer says what he did have, like many lobbyists and donors and interest groups and others, was influence, and in his case, influence drawn from years of public service, from a close relationship to the Cuomo family, and from his senior campaign role, Mr. Roth said. But none of that creates a fiduciary duty to the public. Okay, so, I mean, they're kind of just like saying the quiet part out loud here. He's just admitting, like, yeah, I had dramatic levels of political influence within, the upcoming governor of one of the largest, or if not the single largest cities in the entire United States. Amazing power at his discretion, but, I didn't technically, at the time that this took place, have a fiduciary duty to the public. So he's just like, yeah, I did a little bit of corruption, but technically it's not illegal corruption, and so therefore I had no duty to actually serve the public. What the fuck, right? I mean, they continue here. They say that Mr. Percoco returned to the government about 8 months after he left it following Mr. Cuomo's re-election. So again, it was just an 8-month period where I technically wasn't in government, but was still wielding political influence, so can't call that corruption, right? I mean, this reminds me just so much of many different examples that we could come up with the revolving door of DC politics and just, so many different examples. Like, for example, Joe Biden's current Pentagon chief, Lloyd Austin. This is a guy who was a former top general within the U.S. military. Then he leaves that position, he goes and he works for, guess who? Raytheon, a top weapons manufacturer, right? He gets $1 million payout as he leaves Raytheon, then goes and gets appointed to lead the Pentagon under Joe Biden. So it's just this revolving door of private interests acting in these public government positions, and just nobody questions it. Nobody, throws their hands up as if that's not egregious levels of corruption and wheeling and dealing that's going on behind the scenes, going from private corporations to public positions. I mean, it's just so brazen and obvious, but yet the Supreme Court, it seems like they're going to be ending up siding with this guy with this defense. So they say Nicole F. Reeves, who was a lawyer for the federal government prosecuting this case, said that Mr. Percoco had remained a government official throughout the relevant period as a functional, if not formal matter. Yes, obviously, right? His own lawyer just admitted that himself, right? They say Mr. Percoco, quote, was able to attend internal government meetings that no one else from outside the government was able to attend, Ms. Reeves said, and he continued to have key card access. He continued to order his former secretary around. He continued to use government phones and offices. Sounds like you're pretty much working within the government, right? Even if not technically. But this is what we got from even some of the liberal justices on the Supreme Court. This seems like this is going to be an overwhelming bipartisan decision coming down here. They say Justice Elena Kagan said that Mrs. Reeves' argument went too far. It is one thing to prosecute officials who take a little hiatus and engage in graft, knowing that they will return to government. But Ms. Reeves, in focusing on whether someone was a functional government official, would sweep in many other kinds of people seeking to influence official actions, Justice Kagan said. So, in other words, okay, essentially what they're arguing here, Justice Elena Kagan, she's essentially arguing that, yes, this guy was engaging in pretty nefarious actions, but, if we were going to allow him to be prosecuted for these types of actions, what would stop us from going after other lobbying groups or other big money groups that also try to seek to influence our public officials? I mean, yes, that is corruption. That is also corruption. That should also be illegal. I mean, obviously, technically, it's not illegal because we have effectively legalized bribery and corruption within the United States. I mean, even ever since Citizens United was overturned, especially, it's ramped up significantly. In these recent midterm elections, we had record levels of billionaire spending of corporate money piling into these elections. Yeah, we have a political system that is essentially bought off by corporate America, controlled by the billionaire class, and it's just rampant corruption that has been legalized in this country. That's what we have. That is a problem. That is not a good thing. It would be a good thing to actually, yes, sweep a lot of those other, dark money lobbying groups under this same banner, and maybe we should go after and prosecute them and make that a crime, make that illegal, right? That is not what it means to have a functioning democracy, okay? It's the opposite of that. It's an oligarchy. And so essentially it's looking like they're making the arguments that like this is something that we should just overlook because it would be reaching too far and actually starting to force us to confront the deep rot and corruption that exists within our political system. But they continue here with another quote from her saying, "You don't have to be a former official," said of the lawyer's theory. "You don't need to be a future official. It should not be enough," she said, "to be just a really, really good lobbyist." So again, making that direct comparison here. Again, the lobbying is also corruption, right? They say the justices do not always divide along the usual lines in public corruption cases. Yes, they typically side with the corrupt politicians. They typically side with the interests of capital, right? I mean, we talk all the time about how biased a lot of these Supreme Court justices are. All of the ones that Trump supported came from the goddamn Federalist Society with explicit political intentions. Yet there's a lot of people in this country that want to pretend like the Supreme Court is some sort of a neutral arbiter, an objective interpreter of the Constitution. It's complete fucking bullshit. Not only are they biased on issues like, abortion rights and things like that, just had the overturning of Roe v. Wade just a couple of months ago. Not only are they biased on those things and partisan on issues of, social freedom and things like that, but when it comes to the economy, what you realize here is that the Supreme Court overwhelmingly, and it's not just with individual corruption cases like this, it's also like, the Supreme Court decision on allowing Nestle to effectively get away with child slave labor in some of their farms that they are operating over in West Africa. I mean, every single decision that they are making is to the benefit in a bipartisan consensus way, same exact way that our government operates, our Congress and, our executive branch as well. The judicial branch is the same exact thing. When there's matters of, things that positively impact the military-industrial industrial complex or corporate America, they are going to have some broad consensus in favor of their interests, even if it, is not in the best interest of the public, which is in theory what the Supreme Court is supposed to be acting on behalf of, right? But again, this is just our political system. But they continue saying in 2020, giving other examples where they have sided on behalf of corrupt politicians. In 2020, the court unanimously overturned the convictions of 2 defendants in the so-called Bridgegate scandal, in which associates of Chris Christie, New Jersey's governor at the time, closed access lanes to the George Washington Bridge in 2013 to punish one of the governor's political opponents. That was an abuse of power, the court ruled, but not a federal crime. Why not? Why not? Why is, brazen acts of abuse of power not considered a federal crime? I mean, completely ridiculous. They say similarly, the court in 2016 unanimously overturned the conviction of Bob McDonnell, a former governor of Virginia who had accepted luxury products, loans, and vacations from a business executive. Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr., writing for the court, narrowed the definition of what sort of conduct can serve as the basis of a corruption prosecution. He said that only former and concrete government actions counted. What Mr. McDonnell had done, by contrast, the Chief Justice wrote, was simply arrange meetings for and attend events with his benefactor. Okay, so that's not corruption. That's not criminal behavior right there, because you're not literally coming out and making a public announcement that I got money from this, billionaire or this, a corporation or private actor that was lobbying me, and then turning around and saying, and now I am giving them this, piece of legislation to their benefit as a direct quid pro quo. I mean, effectively what they're saying here and what this ruling is adding to with the, compounding other rulings that they have had, enabling corruption within this country is effectively just saying, if you do not come out and outright say, I am engaging in a quid pro quo, I am engaging in criminal levels of corruption, then it can't really be considered criminal corruption, right? I mean, that's effectively what this ruling is actually going to lead to. So, I mean, I think that this is an important story for more people to be made aware of. But again, it's not even just about these 2 individuals who are very obviously corrupt government officials who abuse their power, who, completely acted against the interests of their actual constituents and the people who they were supposed to be serving, and to the benefit of their own personal financial situation, to the benefit of the people who had lobbied them and given them money behind the scenes, and other companies that had also lobbied them behind the scenes. I mean, it's not just about that. That in and of itself is pretty egregious. Also with those other previous cases with Chris Christie and the 2016 case as well. I mean, obviously all of that is condemnable and bad, but at the same time, it's this is just part of a pattern, right? This is what the Supreme Court does. Similar to our Congress, similar to the executive branch, similar to how every single level of our political system operates today. We are just creeping closer and closer towards an open oligarchy. I mean, I don't know how else you want to say this. It's cronyism, obviously, right? But we effectively have a system where you can engage in just open, brazen acts of corruption and bad faith public service, and it's just, you can't even prosecute it, right? They are overturning the convictions of these guys, right? So they're not even it isn't just a normal trial where they're deciding, oh, okay, we have to weigh the evidence and all that. They are overturning the conviction of these people. Okay, they had already been convicted, right? So they're overturning that and just further enabling these types of corruption scandals, and at the same time disabling the ability for the federal government to actually try to prosecute these cases. I mean, if you have case after case after case that's just getting struck down by the Supreme Court when the federal government tries to go after brazenly corrupt political figures, then obviously they're going to be disincentivized to do that in the future. And Justice Clarence Thomas, as part of his arguments within these hearings, was basically saying that. He was saying, we don't want the federal government to be engaging in these types of prosecutions. We think that's overreach or something. This is something that should just be left to a state-by-state basis, which then, begs follow-up questions to that, which is okay, well, what if their, individual state courts are also dysfunctional or corrupt to some degree? I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. These motherfuckers were obviously engaging in corruption. They obviously, were found guilty and convicted for justified reasons, and you're just coming out here and saying, no, we don't agree with that. We are going to overturn these cases and just further enable the rampant rot of corruption to exist and perpetuate itself within every single level of our government.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying